Healthcare revenue cycle did not become complex overnight. It evolved layer by layer. And today, many leaders are managing outcomes they don't fully see. Denials rise, authorizations stall. Teams believe they are following process. Yet, the results tell a different story. Today we are talking about operational intelligence, not dashboards or reports. Understanding how work actually happens inside the revenue cycle. Because once you see it, you start to understand where performance is won or quietly lost. Our guest today has spent more than 25 years inside that reality, leading, advising, and stabilizing revenue cycle operations at some of the largest health systems in the country. Please welcome Healthcare Revenue Cycle Executive, Len Mandel. And welcome again. This time we're going to discuss operational intelligence. Can you just give us a definition? What is operational intelligence and why should leaders care?
Yeah, it's a good question. Operational intelligence gives you visibility and clarity into the tasks that every user has in your operation. It's that simple, right? It's not like you're looking at metrics and you're saying, wow, our cash is down. Why? Right? The bad debt's up. Why? Right? Operational intelligence tells you my cash is down because my staff's not working their work queues. They're working off work lists, they're out of Excel. And they're copying and pasting, and they're doing all sorts of things except going one account after another in their work queue, right? How are you going to know that? Unless you shoulder somebody and shadow them every day, you're not going to know that.
So when people hear operational intelligence, they often think analytics, but you're describing something deeper. How would you explain it in plain terms?
It's a matter of identifying clarity. Right? It's like turning the lights on in a room that you've been navigating in the dark, right? That's the plain language explanation. All of a sudden, you see where things are, what's blocking you, what's moving, what needs attention, before it becomes a problem, right? Analytics is going to tell you, you bumped into the table yesterday. Terrific. Operational intelligence tells you, there's a table right in front of you. Adjust it now. Well, guess what? If you do that, like operational intelligence is giving you info on, you won't bump into it. It's that simple. You know what I mean? And it's deeper than analytics, right? It connects the dots across the whole operation. So instead of, isolated dashboards, you get a living picture of how work actually flows with the handoffs, the bottlenecks, the delays, the workload, the capacity, the quality. Right? All of it. It's the difference between reading a map and watching live driving, right? So, other things come to mind, right? You have cause and effect, right? It's showing you that, not just the numbers, right? Your analytics is going to say conversions dropped 8%. Okay, what does that mean? Well, operational intelligence is going to tell you conversion dropped because follow-up time doubled after the new routing rule. Well, that's a lot more clarity, wouldn't you think? Right? One's a report. The other's an explanation. So, these things are really, significant, right? So operational intelligence is also giving teams the ability to intervene at the moment, right? Analytics is retrospective. Operational intelligence is real-time and actionable. And it aligns people, not just metrics, right? Operational intelligence makes the work visible in a way that reduces finger pointing, clarifies ownership, very important, right? Ownership. Exposes friction, builds shared understanding. It's not just data, Sandy, it's shared truth. And the shortest version, analytics tells you what happened. Operational intelligence tells you what's happening, why it's happening, and what to do about it. Here's a situation. A hospital's revenue cycle leadership believed they had the denials problem, and with that, the analytics are showing the denials are rising, cash collections are slowing, AR days are creeping up. So they focus on denial management, more audits, more training, more appeals, but nothing improved. But what operational visibility revealed, once they gained real-time visibility to how work actually flowed across the revenue cycle, the story changed. They discovered front-end registration errors had quietly increased by 18% after a staffing change. Insurance verification was backlogged by 3 to 4 days because one queue was overloaded. Just one queue. Claims were being submitted with missing or outdated insurance information. Those claims were then denied downstream, Sandy, but it's making it look like a coding or billing issue, and it's not. So in other words, they didn't have a denials problem. They had a front-end throughput problem. Analytics only showed the outcome in the denials, but operational intelligence exposed the cause, which was front-end friction. And then the impact? Once they fixed the upstream issues, the registration accuracy improved. The verification delays disappeared. Clean claim rate jumped, denials dropped, and the denials dropped without even adding staff or changing coding workflows. The team didn't suddenly get better at appeals. They removed the operational bottleneck that was creating the denials in the first place.
Team believe they are following SOP, yet the outcomes will vary wildly. Where does that drift begin?
The drift actually begins when the SOPs describe the intended workflow, but not the lived workflow. Let me say that again, because this is really significant. The standard operating procedures, or SOPs, describe the intended workflow, not the lived workflow, what's really happening, right? That's a problem, right? Teams believe they're following the SOP because they know the steps. They understand the intent. They're doing what usually works. But in reality, workloads shift, staffing changes. Systems have become inconsistent, and they behave inconsistently. Edge cases become the norm. So the SOP becomes a reference point, not a reality. Drift begins when people start making micro adjustments to keep work moving. Those adjustments feel harmless, like even helpful, but they definitely compound. So what happens in front-end authorization workflows, for instance, right? Front-end auth, it's one of the most fragile parts of the revenue cycle because it relies on accurate intake, correct insurance capture, timely verification, precise documentation, payer-specific rules. I can go on, right? Just think about that. Just to get the authorization, right? And that's impossible, right? So the drift creeps in because of the intake shortcuts. You have verification delays. The payer rules change, and they change quietly, right? They're not all of a sudden going to announce it in a big neon sign. So people have to figure that out, right? Authorization notes get inconsistent. Workarounds become the norm, Sandy. And that's a problem right there, right? Because, again, someone discovers a shortcut, they can get the claim out faster. Well, that's not always great, right? But if everyone adopts it and no one realizes it breaks compliance for 20-plus cases, none of these feel like big mistakes, but they feel like getting the job done. Well, that's a problem, right? And that's a big problem, with downstream denials. These small deviations definitely create the downstream denials. Think of revenue cycle like a conveyor belt, right? So you have a chain reaction. And that's a problem, right? For one tiny misalignment. You have a missing detail, incorrect insurance mapping, a delayed verification, outdated eligibility, a missed authorization, right, for a medical necessity denial, inconsistent documentation, right, that leads to coding ambiguity, and a temporary workaround, right, which causes a systemic error. Denial spike and no one can trace the origin. By the time the denial hits, the root cause is buried under layers of workflow. Well, guess what? That root cause can be identified through operational intelligence. That's why it becomes so significant. So, when you think about all these things, right, the core truth is that the revenue cycle drift doesn't start with big mistakes. It starts with small, invisible deviations that compound because one can see them in real time, right? Operational visibility doesn't just show performance. It reveals the behavior of the workflow, which is where the story lives, right? That's the real story.
Complexity isn't really the problem then. Invisible variation is. Would you agree?
The deviation, yeah, right? How are you going to see the deviations that you have 200-300 people out there on the floor? What are they doing, right? Again, they have an SOP, it's documented. But how are you going to determine if they're following it right? Or, like I said, if things change and they do workarounds? That's where the operational intelligence comes in, right? That's the living truth. And that's where we have to go, with regards to our analysis of revenue cycle quality and productivity. What does that look like, right? So, all these things add up. But in order to stabilize it, we have to look at the living workflow, not the SOP.
What's striking is that the system isn't failing, execution is quietly diverging, and you don't know. That's very insightful. Anyway, let's jump to the next things. Once operational intelligence exposes these hidden gaps that you'd mentioned, what should leaders do first?
The instinct's to fix everything at once, but that's never going to happen. And it's not even a smart strategy, right? Because teams are already stretched. The gaps you're seeing didn't appear overnight. The smartest leaders start by stabilizing the system, not by launching a dozen initiatives. So I always recommend start with one. Just take one, fix the highest leverage breakdown first. Operational intelligence will surface dozens of micro failures, but there's always one pattern that's driving the majority of downstream pain: a backlog, a handoff, a payroll, a documentation inconsistency, right? One of the examples that I saw in operational intelligence had to do with a payer rule change, right? The staff was copying and pasting information 500 times in a week, right? And when questioned, they said, well, the payer changed something. Well, why didn't the staff let somebody know? Without operational intelligence, nobody would have seen that, right? So again, that was the highest leverage point right there. Operational intelligence surfaced that, and that's what the leadership team decided to fix first, right? Pick one significant thing instead of trying to fix everything, because trying to fix everything, it's going to dilute the focus and overwhelm the teams. And then the main message, right? This is really important. Avoid overwhelming the teams by reducing the problem to behavior, not blame, right? Again, the problem is not, anything for these people to be judged by, because they're getting overwhelmed, especially when they're being judged, when they're being asked to work harder, when they're told that they're doing it wrong. That's not right, the gaps have to be framed as system behavior, not personal failure. And that's the more significant approach, right? The queue's backing up because the routing rule changed, not because you're not keeping up with your work, right? That's a big difference, right? Not because you're not following the SOP. Well, the SOP doesn't match the workflow anymore. Somebody has to say something. So when people understand that the system created the drift, they're far more willing to help to correct it.
Makes sense. So the win isn't just visibility, it's how leaders respond to what they see.
That's right. That's right. It's the situation. It's not the person, right? Again, people don't genuinely want to do a bad job, Sandy, right? They want to finish their work queues. They want to do it with quality, right? And things change, right? To divert from certain, processes or procedures. When teams can see where the work is stuck, how long the tasks sit, where the handoffs break, how their actions affect downstream teams, they naturally self-correct, right? Visibility creates discipline because it removes ambiguity. It reduces finger pointing. It aligns everyone around the same reality, right? You don't have to enforce discipline. The workflow itself does, right? So what's the living workflow? And how do we identify where the breakdown points are? And everybody takes a look at that movie. It is like watching the same movie together, right? Who owns this step? Who clears this queue? Who updates this rule? Everybody's accountable, right? Accountability becomes clarity, not punishment. So the goal's not to find fault. It's to ensure every part of the workflow has an owner, and that owner can act when something drifts. So the core principle here, once you can see the work, you don't need to push harder. You need to intervene smarter. That's the main message. Operational intelligence doesn't just reveal gaps. It gives leaders the ability to fix them that way that strengthens the culture instead of straining it.
So let's elevate this to leadership. How directly do workflow deviations translate into financial leakage?
Yeah, it's a big deal, right? Leaders often think of operational drift as an efficiency issue, right? In a revenue cycle, it's a cash issue. Every deviation has a dollar value attached to it, right? So we need to take a look at things about where the deviations are coming from, because every deviation introduces friction, and friction becomes delay. Every deviation increases the probability of a denial, right? Denials aren't random. They're the outcome of missing data, incorrect data, late data, inconsistent data. A single deviation can multiply into a denial, an appeal, a write-off. The financial leakage is immediate and measurable, right? And every deviation forces manual rework. Rework's a problem, man. It's a congestion point. When workflows drift, teams spend hours chasing documentation, correcting claims, resubmitting claims, appealing claims. Rework doesn't just cost labor, it delays cash and increases the chance of permanent loss. And then, Sandy, every deviation compounds across the workflow, right? Because revenue cycle is a chain. A small break in one link weakens the entire system. A 5% increase in front-end errors doesn't create a 5% financial impact. It creates 30 to 50% downstream impact because every subsequent step amplifies the original deviation. Right? Just think about that. It's a compound problem, So, your denial strategies are failing without operational clarity. That operational clarity is pretty significant because without it, leaders are fighting the wrong problem at the wrong point with the wrong tools, right? So think what operational intelligence gives you, that visibility and the clarity of what's the right problem, what's the right point. And it's accurate. It shows you exactly where to focus because you can see the gaps. And that's significant, right? When decisions become easier, that's something else that the leaders understand the flow better. Operational clarity gives leaders something they really have, the ability to see how work actually moves. Once they have that, several decisions become dramatically easier, right? Where's the work piling up? Which queues are overloaded? What capacities mismatch, right? So they can make better staffing decisions, right? Instead of guessing where the workflow breaks, they'll see the exact step, the handoff, the exact rule, the behavior, right? So they can do accurate process redesign, And then you've got the technology investment decisions. Leaders stop buying tools to fix everything. Then they start investing where automation or integration will actually move the needle. Things like, denial prevention decisions come to mind. But, with more accurate flows visibility, the leaders can identify upstream causes. They can intervene earlier. They can prevent denials before they exist. So denial management becomes denial prevention. And then more importantly, the accountability factor, right? Clarity changes accountability, Sandy, right? It's not punitive accountability. It's clarity accountability. Who owns this step? Who clears this queue? Who updates the rule? Who responds when drift appears? Leaders stop managing outcomes and start managing flow. And then operational drift is the root cause of financial leakage. Operational intelligence is the only way to see it. Let me repeat that. Operational drift is the root cause of financial leakage. Operational intelligence is the only way to see it, right? Because you're seeing the living workflow. And once leaders can see the flow, every decision becomes simpler, faster, and more accurate.
Interesting. So if a revenue cycle leader listening right now wanted to apply one principle from this conversation, what should they start questioning inside their own operation?
That's a good question. So, I would encourage they start questioning where they think the workflow is inconsistent, because that's where it's drifting the most. They have to, look for the problems, right? Where are the outcomes bad? The real linkage hides in the places where everyone says we're following the process. That's where the leakage is, because there's a blind spot, right? That's where the variation lives. That's where the money leaks. So how do we translate that principle into leadership level thinking? You have to consider, right? Where's the steady parts of the workflow, not just the broken ones? Why do denial strategies fail without operational clarity, right? What decisions become easier when leaders truly understand the workflow, right? Staffing decisions, process decisions, technology, and all feeds into things like denial prevention. But more importantly, the accountability decisions. You gain clarity on ownership without reporting to blame. Operational clarity turns leadership from reactive to strength. That's the main message, right? The operational clarity. We're no longer being reactive. We see things real time in the living workflow. That enables us to become strategic.
So, Len, thank you very much. But in closing, I want to, as a technologist, when I've heard you explain operational intelligence, it sounds a little bit like what some others have done in other space, process mining, right? This process mining company. When you talk about operational intelligence in revenue cycle, why didn't we just go and take one of those business process mining company? And I mean, this technology have existed forever. What's so unique? Anybody who's looking at operational intelligence in RCM, knowing that process mining already existed before, because a lot of the thing you're explaining seems like to be like process mining to me. So educate me a little bit more on that so that I understand it.
So you have process mining, you've had task mining. That shows the actual tasks, right? The actual process. What it's missing is the AI component, right? To interpret it. That's what operational intelligence is today with the AI. It's interpreting where do we have increased gaps? Where do we have, to fix them, and how do we fix them? How do we prioritize what's really going to drive cash versus what's not, right? That's the difference between operational intelligence today, Sandy, and the task mining and process mining from a few years ago, right? It's become more intuitive. It's become smarter, right? To call out something like I mentioned earlier, where you find, one of your staff is copying and pasting to a clipboard 500 times in a week. Okay, well, that gets called out as a gap in quality production, right? It's a deviation from a standard operating procedure. That's where the AI comes into effect, right? Before it was just a standalone task. Now we've got, all this technology that's going to interpret those tasks and tell a story about it. Does that make sense? It's going to tell us where we're failing, right? It's going to tell us how to unlock things. It's going to give us visibility in the financial leakage, workflow drift, denial patterns, all of that, right? Where's our operational blind spot? It's not just going to be facts. There's going to be interpretation to it. We're applying intelligence, right? Operational intelligence is different than task mining.
Would you agree with me that if any company that's trying to do this, they should have some really deep knowledge around revenue cycle and how it works?
I agree.
Would you agree with that?
I agree. That's right. I mean, you have these automation, platforms. I won't name names, but some of the tops in the industry, right? They've got the technology to find out what every single task you're doing, but they don't have the knowledge, like you just said, Sandy, to interpret it. That's a gap, right? So, you have revenue cycle companies that are able to do operational intelligence, and they can call out what's, cash producing activity versus administrative activity that means nothing. Like, why are you doing all this administrative work in the middle of the day when you should be following up the payers? Okay, well, that again is insight that wasn't there before. But you have revenue cycle companies that have the capabilities to do operational intelligence. They're able to tell the story, what goes with those tasks. Again, what does the living workflow look like? Is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? And how do we define and identify that workflow so it's optimized? Your technology companies can't do that, right? That's why, I would encourage the partnership with a revenue cycle firm that has the capabilities and a strong application in operational intelligence. For that interpretation itself becomes invaluable.
Oh, this is cool. Maybe next time when you get together, you and I, we can tell the story about when we met, I don't know, probably over a decade ago, close to that, when I introduced you to robotic process automation and how you took that whole idea and brought it to the healthcare industry. That should make for a good conversation.
I would love to share that, Sandy, because now I'm looking to bring operational intelligence to the healthcare community. I'll be glad to go over that with you. Thank you, Sandy.